you, Jim, very much, and thank all of you for being here, and thank you for the invitation. It's nice to be back. I was here in Baton Rouge yesterday and here in Baton Rouge today, and I'm beginning to like it more and more. It's such a pleasure to be here. My second child was actually born in Baton Rouge, and so it's good to be home here. One of the things some years ago that before speaking, I'd always tell a story. I don't know if you heard it, about George Washington being born in Louisiana. I don't know if you've ever heard that or not. But he was born in Louisiana. And he came home one day, and they had a very lovely oak tree growing in front of their house, and I think in Wyclosky. And his father looked around, and his father saw the tree was chopped down, and he was very upset about that. And he tries to figure out who did it, and he sees a little hatchet, and then he sees young George hiding. And he says, "Now, George," he says, "you don't tell a lie. You tell me the truth." He said, "Did you chop down the oak tree?" And young George looked at him and he said, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. I did." And at that point, Washington's father grabbed him and said, "We're moving to Virginia because you'll never make it in politics in Louisiana." Now, that used to be funny some time ago, but now I don't think you can get away from it even moving to Virginia or anywhere else. So unfortunately, I guess we're all in that same boat. But thank you for being here. I wanted to talk about a few different things. I'll keep it brief, 2 hours max. But I want to talk a little bit about polls. We hear a lot about polling. A lot of people are wondering if they're any good anymore. And I wanted to talk about that. And also wanted to talk about the current landscape in national politics and why it is the way it is. In terms of polls, well, first of all, when I decided to go into the polling business full time, one of my nephews heard about it, and he said, I told him, he said, "Well, no, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm going to be a pollster." And he said, "Well, that's really good. I'm happy to hear that." He said, "Because I have a sofa that needs to be recovered." So, anyway. But as we know, there's more and more polls that are covered by the media all the time. And I actually think there's too much, frankly, even though I've participated in that, but I do think it's too much. And but nevertheless, it's here and it's here to stay. In the last two presidential elections, the polls painted a picture of the two elections that were different from what ultimately happened. And so a lot of people said, "Well, wait a minute, we can't believe these things anymore. What's going on?" And it's a valid question, even though I have been in the polling business. I have some serious problems with the way some people do polls now. And even though a lot of the people who do a lot of these national polls are friends of mine, they're all competitors of mine too. So I have no interest in protecting bad work. But on the other side of the coin, there is another side of the story as well. In the last presidential election, of the 21 final national polls, let me see, I think I have this here that I can, in the final polls, and I'm not going to get into the weeds on the numbers, but you kind of have to look at the numbers. Biden averaged 51.5%, and he received 51.3% of the vote. That's pretty close. But Trump averaged 43.3% in the polls and received almost 47% of the vote. Biden's poll average was an 8.2% margin, but his actual margin was 4.4%. So the polls got Biden right, but they didn't get Trump right. So when Republicans said wait a minute, these polls are underpolling our voters. They were right. They were underpolling Republicans. And so people were asking the question, why? Because even though some polling firms and sponsors may have an interest in promoting one side or the other, for the most part, most pollsters want their polls to be accurate because their names are on that. They have to sell their accuracy to get business. So they're not looking to do phony polls. They're looking to do accurate polling. Now, in the 2020 U.S. Senate races, and we took a look at those, and we found that 57 of the polls had the right winner, and 32 of the final polls had the wrong winner. Now, 32 is a lot to have the wrong winner. That was a real problem. 63% of individual polls had the right winner, and 67% for poll averages. So the point there is that you do better looking at averages of multiple polls than just looking at individual polls. And I started doing that about 20 years ago, and my friends in the polling business said that's a terrible idea. And now everybody does it because they realize that there's so many polls out there, and one day a poll might show Biden going down, and everybody says, oh, he's at 37%. And I say, well, he's at 37% in that poll, but in the other polls, he's over 42%. So the average is 41%. So anyway, so you want to look at polls like that. But anyway, in the last U.S. Senate races, the polls underestimated the Republican vote in 10 of 11 major races across the nation. So when you see something like that, you have to come to the conclusion there is a problem and there is a partisan bias in polling. And is it because people are against Republicans who do polls? Well, it's hard to guess on motivation, but there's a lot of reasons for it. And here's some of the reasons why polls are off. One is just the normal margin of error. Any of you who have studied statistics or used them in your work know that scientific sampling is really pretty good, but there is a margin of error even when everything works competently. It's going to be it can be a few points off either way. So that's possible. But if the error is on the side of Republicans and not Democrats, then you say, well, that's not necessarily a random error. It seems to be biased. You also have to keep in mind that polls are snapshots in time, not crystal balls. So if you take a poll 2 weeks before an election and it shows one thing, there may be events that happen in the last 2 weeks that change the situation so that the final results may be different than the poll, even though the poll may have been right at the time it was taken. Trump in some ways is unique. I do think there has been a hidden Trump vote. Not an enormous vote, but a couple of points, a few points as we see. And it's an issue that we have seen in polling before. There are some candidates for public office that voters don't want to say they're for. And Trump is one of them. And so some people who voted for Trump didn't want to admit they did prior to the election. We saw that when David Duke ran for governor of Louisiana. Years earlier, all of you are too young to remember this, but when Jim Garrison was DA of New Orleans, that was a big problem in polling Jim Garrison because people didn't want to say that they were for him. So that is a factor when it comes to Trump, but it's not necessarily a factor when it comes to Republican Senate candidates. And then finally, some pollsters screwed up. Polling has gone from being something that was done door to door to something that was done through landline phones. Now, you can't get people just through landline phones. You have to do most of your polling through cell phones now, which, by the way, cost twice as much as it used to cost. And on top of that, Some people are using these automated methods that actually work better than you would think they should. Because when the data comes in, it looks kind of a mess, but a lot of national polling firms who are doing it and trying to do it right, are coming up with fairly decent numbers despite that. I also think nationally that there is a partisan bias in a lot of the so-called nonpartisan polls that have been done for major networks in newspapers. And I think the reason is because even though the Washington Post poll and the New York Times polling and CBS and CNN polling have been nonpartisan, I think a lot of people who worked for those polling firms were partisan. And they weren't trying to jimmy the poll in favor of anybody. They just had a partisan outlook about how the electorate looks that was actually biased against Republicans. And I think that's really happened. And you may have noticed almost all these organizations have changed their polling system since the last election. And so we'll see where it goes. Now, just to defend polling for a moment, it's not perfect, but when you think about it, it's the only way to measure public opinion. You have no other way to measure it. That's all you got. You can ask how many people in here are for somebody or against somebody, but this isn't a representative sample of the whole state. None of us are representative of the whole state. Any individual groups aren't going to be. And in business, as well as in politics, the best technique now is to combine polling with other tools like social listening and qualitative research, focus groups and the like, so that you get a full picture of it. You got to have polls if you want to do message development. And that's true for politics, issue campaigns, as well as corporate consumer research, ad testing, targeting, issues, whatever it may be. And now, when you look at polling, many polls are right. In fact, I dare say a good majority of polls are right. If you look at recent polling in some of the elections in the Virginia governor's race, in the New Jersey governor's race, not as good as Virginia, but in Virginia it was only about a point and a half off. In New Jersey it was 2.5 points off because the Republican candidate was moving up at the end and was closing it up. The New York City mayor's race, the Boston race, the last New Orleans race. I can tell you, I did a citywide survey in the New Orleans mayor's race and showed the incumbent mayor getting 64% of the vote. She got 65. So, you can, and other people have done that too. I'm not just patting myself on the back, although I am patting myself on the back. But the point is, if you're careful and you spend the money and do it right, you can do accurate polling. But good pollsters are capable of doing some bad polls, just like bad pollsters are capable of doing good polls. A stop clock is right twice a day. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the whole idea of partisanship. And the question I get in places around Louisiana and around the country is, why are things so divided now? Why is it so vicious, more so than it had been for some time? And there are reasons for that. One reason is technology. Technology has given us the tools to attack people, to lie, to say all kinds of things without being responsible for it, and to do it instantly and without a lot of cost. And that's had a big impact, and that includes 24-hour cable, particularly the national cable TV networks. It includes the internet, obviously, social media, particularly, and where conflict is what gets clicks. And getting clicks is how you measure how you get paid in the business and who makes money in the business. So there's natural economic and technological forces that are creating a communications environment that puts a premium on conflict. I can tell you, if you had two people on one of the networks fighting versus two people agreeing, you're going to get more people watching the fight. And I remember coming out of CNN one day, and I was on a CNN news show with a friend of mine who was a Democratic political consultant and a friend of mine who was a Republican political consultant. And I don't remember what the issue was, but they each were talking the partisan talking points, and I basically had to say, well, I don't agree with either one. And when it was over with, they both came up to me and said, oh, you're right, but we had to say that, because the political parties sent us the talking points, and that's what they want. And I can't go against it because they get me my business. And I said, guys, I said, that actually angers me. I said, because you all are very intelligent, knowledgeable people. You just went on national television and lied, and you knew better. And that's just not right. And but that's what's happening right now. Now, one thing we have seen, a lot of people say, well, what's wrong with partisanship? That's just people fighting over different principles, and that's correct. We had partisanship in this country where people fought robustly and went after one another and stood on their principles, left and right and middle, and there was nothing wrong with that, nor is there anything wrong with that today. But the partisanship over time became excessive. And then now we're in a situation where it's not just excessive anymore, it's homicidal. It's about killing the other side. And I can give you all kind of stories. I won't bore you with them. Oh, some of them are kind of interesting. About displays of what I'd call homicidal partisanship going on in Congress today. And it would shock you to hear people say, oh, we don't care about doing the right thing. We just want to be able to use this issue against the other side in the next election. Saying that, outright saying that. And even for somebody like me who's been through Louisiana politics and seen all kinds of things, something like that was shocking and hard to take. One of the things, too, that we see going on is money. The amount of money going into politics now the volume of it is really shocking. I've always believed in basically an unregulated political money system because I think the regulations shape the system in bad ways, and I think the regulations that have been passed have screwed it up in bad ways. But the amount has gotten so tremendous now. In the last election for Senate in South Carolina, the U.S. Senate with Lindsey Graham and Jamie Harrison, and South Carolina is about the size of Louisiana. They spent $300 million in a U.S. Senate race. Now, when Bill Clinton and Bob Dole ran for president in 1996, they spent $84 million in total combined. And now they're spending hundreds of millions in South Carolina on a Senate race that ultimately didn't even prove to be that competitive. In the Georgia Senate races, where they had the second primary and all of that, they spent over $500 million in Senate races. I remember when candidates for governor back in the 1970s, their objective was to raise $1 million to run for governor of Louisiana. That was considered the budget. Now it's 10, 15, 20 million. And, but hundreds of millions. I mean, the money is getting out of control. And because there's so much money in the system, it's really beginning to have a big influence on how interest groups act and advocacy groups act and political candidates and political parties act, because the money is just flooding everything, and the money is raised by creating conflict. And if you ever look at online fundraising, I'm sure many of you are on one of the party's fundraising list, and every 5 minutes you get a fundraising thing, and the fundraising appeal is always Chicken Little. The sky's falling. If you don't send $25, the whole country is going to go down the tubes tomorrow. And they say things, and they lie, and they exaggerate, and they deceive, in a terrible way. But it's producing money. It's producing enormous sums of money, and that's having a big impact. And that's increasing partisanship, because people in the center and people who are looking for common ground have trouble raising money. But it's the tough partisans and the tough ideologues on the end who are getting the money. The other thing that is difficult to see is political parties now are all about what they call base votes or base strategies. We have to get our vote out. We have to get our vote out. I saw a news article the other day saying, well, the Democrats did that because it appeals to their base constituencies. The Republican did that because it appeals to their base constituencies. I was thinking, what about the independents? What about the swing voters in the middle? I said, they're the one who decides elections. Sure, the base constituencies are important. Sure, they have to turn them out, of course. That's always been an important part of politics. But when you ignore the people in the middle who are cross-pressured, there are a lot of voters in this country who don't like Biden or Trump, okay, which we'll talk about in a moment. But so then they have to look for reasons to vote for or against somebody. And so the point is that when you're appealing only to your party's base, you're not persuading anybody. You're just prodding them to vote. And when you're not persuading anybody, you don't have to explain issues. You don't have to defend issues. You don't have to talk about the things that are really important. And that's now seeped into everything. And what I'm going to say is a criticism of Democrats, but it applies to Republicans too. They went through this $3.5 trillion Build Back Better program, and for months, it didn't even have a program. It just had a title and a dollar amount, a price tag, and it was like, well, we want to spend $3.5 trillion, and it didn't have specific programs. It didn't have things that went through committee. It was just a dollar amount. Nobody explained anything to voters or even supporters. And then they wonder, well, why aren't people supporting this bill? Well, you got to explain things. You got to explain things. And that's happening all over. Now, to talk a little bit about political independence and people in the middle, and I'm sure many of you fall into that category. Many probably don't. But the last two presidents, both Biden and Trump, were elected by the same people, independents. Now you don't hear that around much, but it's the case. Independents voted for Biden 54-41. When Trump won, independents voted for him by a 4-point margin. Without the margins that Biden and Trump had among independents, they would have lost. In Georgia, for example, a state that Biden won by 0.2 of a point, he carried independents by 9%. In Michigan in 2016, a state that Trump won by 0.2 of a point, he carried independents by 16%. So even though the Republican base and the Democratic base was important and essential to getting them to that point, they ultimately needed people in the middle who weren't that hot on either one of them, to persuade them one way or another. And I think our politics are beginning to lose that. One thing, let's see, I guess it helps if I don't mistakenly turn this off. Well, anyway, I turned it off, but if somebody can turn it back on, fine, but it's not essential. Okay. I think I pressed the wrong button here. You don't ever want to elect me president because I've always pressed the wrong buttons. I could end up blowing up New Jersey and I wouldn't even know it. But anyway, one thing that we should keep in mind is labels. People talk about different things, but there's differences in all these labels. An independent is a partisan position. That means you're neither a Democrat nor a Republican. A centrist is an ideological position. It means you're somewhere between the right and the left. Moderate really has nothing to do with partisanship or ideology. It's really about temperament and tone. So you have moderates, around the country in the U.S. Senate, governors, presidential candidates, who are moderate in temper and tone, but they are strong conservatives or they are strong liberals, but they act in a way that sort of tries to bring people together and work together. Bipartisanship is about coalition building, and cross-pressure voters are voters who are conflicted, who are saying, I like this, but I don't like that. And so all these things are important in politics, and they're getting lost in the shuffle. Now, in terms of where we are in national elections, you don't need me to tell you that President Biden's numbers in the polls are doing very poorly right now. His average approval as of yesterday was 41 points, which is 10 points lower than the popular vote he got in 2020. He got 51%. So his approval is 10 points lower. And he has the biggest fall off between vote and approval of any modern president since polling has begun. I've got a column that will appear in the Advocate on Monday that talks about this. And now, and also, every president who had job ratings below 50% had significant losses in the next midterm election. So at a 41%, even if he can get it up to 43, 44, 44%, it's likely that the Democrats will have significant losses. And there's a few reasons for that. Number one, the Democrats have really been talking about the wrong issues. Voters are interested in inflation and the economy and the border security and a number of things that the Democrats haven't been talking about. And I think that's been a mistake. They also have developed associations with left-wing, with extreme left-wing people and groups, getting rid of the Abraham Lincoln statues and, extreme political correctness and whatever. And a lot of liberal, progressive people tell me, well, why are we taking the hit for these things? Nobody's defunded the police department anywhere. I said, well, people maybe didn't defund it in the sense of getting rid of a police department, but they've cut budgets, and that's been associated with Democrats, not Republicans. So the Democrats are dealing with that. Now, in terms of the next presidential election, when you look at the polling, one thing becomes very obvious, and that is it's possible the voters may not want either Biden or Trump. And in a recent poll, national poll, 70% of the voters nationwide said they don't want Biden to run again. So if a Republican would see that, they'd say, yippee. But then the next question asked if they wanted Trump to run again. And 72% didn't want to see Trump run again. So that sounds to me like people may be looking for a new face in 2024, or a few new faces, whoever they may be. And I was talking to Jim about it earlier, but it reminds me, everything can be analogized to a previous Louisiana election. In 1971, and most of you are not old enough to remember 1971, I know, but we had one of the biggest, most interesting governor's elections ever. In fact, it literally was the most expensive governor's election in the country. It's history at that time. And that's the one Edwin Edwards ultimately won. But at the beginning of the campaign, you had Jimmy Davis running. He was a former two-term governor. You had the incumbent lieutenant governor running, Taddy Aycock. You had John Schwegman, who was a big consumer advocate, very popular. You had Gillis Long, who was a member of Congress and had run for governor before and was part of the Long family. And so people thought one of those candidates would win. Can Jimmy Davis win again? Can he beat Gillis Law? That was all the whole thing. And then Edwards got in the race, and they said, he's, some Cajun that nobody knows. And Bennett Johnson got in the race. He's up there in Shreveport. Nobody knows him. But they were the new faces. And they caught on, and they were the ones who made the runoff. And one of them ended up being a four-term governor, and another one ended up being, I guess, a four-term U.S. senator. So there was a time for a new face there. I feel like that's the case nationally. It may not happen because of the reasons we talked about, money and the structure of the political parties and the inflexibility and paralysis of the political system to be flexible enough. But it certainly could happen. And who knows whether it will or not, but anyway, that's where we are. I'd be happy to entertain any questions as long as they're not difficult. Yes, sir.
Is the mainstream media biased, and is it controlled by too few people?
It's not necessarily controlled by too few people, because there's an awful lot of people now in these media organizations, and they all have their own agendas, and those agendas are not easy to put together in one room. But are they biased? Yes, they're biased. The mainstream media has, I'm an independent. I used to be a moderate conservative Democrat when I was in the legislature many years ago. And I said this at the time, the media had been biased against Republicans. Not so much because they opposed Republicans in elections, but because of the way they framed issues. There's a lot of issues where the media tends to frame the issue, using more of a liberal perspective on things. But in recent years, with Fox News and talk radio and all the bloggers, conservative bloggers, there is a whole lot of other voices now that's attacking that. The problem now is everything's in a silo. And news is, there's so few news organs anymore. It's opinion organs now. And, I don't care whether you're liberal or conservative. I just like to sit down and see more news, and less people like me, on television commenting about the news. You're smart enough to understand what the news is. You don't need people to tell you what it means, particularly if what they're telling you are sound bites that were written for them by political interests. So yeah, I think that has been a problem, and but it's a different problem than the political parties see it. It's there's also a competency problem. As news has become more corporatized, and the bottom line has become really important now, and you got to get those clicks on the internet. You got to get those clicks. And so it puts a lot of financial pressure on them to do programming that's cheap and gets clicks and audiences and eyeballs. And that programming tends to be conflict oriented. How many people are you going to get if you said, we're going to have a show tonight talking about people working together and finding common ground on issues? It's like, we're going to go to sleep. Yes, sir.
Would you care to comment on the territory that Senator Cassidy has staked out for himself?
Well, I would be happy to. I happen to believe that, and I'm not getting into motivations about why politicians do things, and that's not my job. But I happen to believe that he is now, if he wants to run for governor, he would be the strongest candidate for governor if he would get in the governor's race. I think he is better positioned to build a bipartisan coalition than anybody. I think the field he is running against is not particularly well known, and they don't particularly have a strong base. And so I think if he got in the race, he'd be a very strong candidate. If he could get into a runoff, I think he'd probably beat anybody in the runoff. And frankly, I think he'd be a stronger candidate for governor than re-election, because it's a, you know, he can focus on state issues and get away from the, you know, the national mess.
Thank you.
Thank you.